The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We will start shortly, but I just wanted to touch on some housekeeping items. My name is Veronica Rodriguez, and I'm with the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living. I want to thank you for joining our first Live Smart Texas webinar series. So first, I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived along with the presentation slides on our website at msdcenter.org. We will also be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to enter your questions as they come up in your questions chat box in your control panel. So now I will hand it over to Dr. Leah Wiggum, and she will talk to us about misconceptions about obesity.
Thank you, Veronica, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to the Live Smart Texas webinar series. I am a member of the steering committee of Live Smart Texas and newly moved into the role of co-chair of that coalition as well. And so I'm very happy to be part of bringing this webinar series to all of you who are online with us today. I also serve as the executive director of the Paso del Norte Institute for Healthy Living and an associate professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. Our institute serves as a backbone organization for the Paso del Norte Health Foundation's Healthy Eating, Active Living Initiative, or HEAL initiative. And that initiative covers a region that includes 3 counties in southern New Mexico, 2 counties in West Texas, as well as Ciudad Juarez in Chihuahua, Mexico. And the work of our institute is to increase healthy eating and active living by providing a bridge between science and application that empowers individuals, families, organizations, and communities to build a culture of health. This work is supported through funding from the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about what we do in this part of the state of Texas and southern New Mexico, and then I'll jump into the presentation for today. We use a collective impact model, and in our role as a backbone organization, that collective impact model indicates that by working together with a common agenda and support from the backbone organization to align mutually reinforcing activities and ensure continuous communication, along with a shared measurement system that includes collecting qualitative and quantitative objective measures to identify if the common agenda objectives are being met. By coordinating those 5 components of the collective impact model, we can lead to a larger impact that's longer lasting and more sustainable. And so that's really what our role as a backbone organization for the Healthy Eating Active Living Initiative focuses on doing. In that role, we recognize that obesity is a complex disease, and in order to address a complex disease, you need to work at many different levels and across multiple sectors to have an opportunity at success in changing any of the health outcomes that you're targeting. Because obesity is so complex and therefore it's very challenging to impact outcomes related to obesity and impact behaviors that can be involved in supporting healthier body weights, we also strive to focus our efforts on strategies that have the best evidence base to support them. So it seems pretty logical, but sometimes in the world of community and public health, we oftentimes don't know or lose sight of which strategies have the best scientific evidence from clinical and laboratory science, and therefore should be the focus of our efforts in our community and public health work. Because as we all know, there's so much work to be done and so little resources, funding, time, and personnel to do that work, that we really want to ensure we're selecting strategies that will allow us to have the largest impact. So this slide here just indicates how complex obesity is. It's an infographic that's available at the Obesity Society's website, www.obesity.org, and you can access this in the archived slides after the talk. I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but just getting at the importance of using evidence-based approaches to try and impact this complex system is what we're here to talk about today. So we're going to talk about some common misconceptions about obesity, but I hope to do it in a way that engages all of you and makes it fun and interactive. So I'm going to present a framework of different concepts around obesity. And I'm going to present these statements one by one and ask each of you to vote whether you think the particular statement is a myth, a presumption, or a fact. And for the purposes of this presentation, we will define myths as widely held beliefs, but there's evidence that exists to refute those statements. Presumptions are widely held beliefs that have neither been proven nor disproven. And facts are things that we know with reasonable confidence that can lead to practical implications for public health, policy, or clinical recommendations. So of course, in that context of how we choose which strategies to focus our efforts on, we want to focus on facts as often as possible and align our strategies with things that are fairly well established. However, we also know that sometimes we're doing work and there just are no studies to prove or disprove. In other words, they will be presumptions. And in those cases, it's very important that those of us doing this work do a good job collecting objective data so that we can contribute to the broader knowledge base with regards to whether some of these presumptions might shift more towards fact, or we may discover our myths. So if we're not out there collecting data, which is an important part of that collective impact model I showed you, then we really don't make any progress in understanding when our presumptions might lean more towards a fact or a myth. And then of course, when there are areas that we understand to be myths, based on the scientific evidence, we want to avoid spending our time, money, and other resources focusing in those areas. I do want to make it clear that the framework for this presentation and interaction today is based on a publication that a colleague of mine, Dr. David Allison, was the senior author for. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and you can see the citation at the bottom of every slide as we go through. So I took that framework from that publication. These definitions for myths, presumptions, and facts are based on the definitions used by these co-authors in that publication. And then you'll see along the way, I've added some evidence to explain the decisions that the authors came to. Both evidence that they provided in their paper and in some cases additional evidence that I've provided from the scientific literature and my own research publications. So our first statement today is that small sustained changes in energy intake or expenditure will produce large long-term weight changes. So I just activated the poll, and I would like you all to vote and let me know if you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact. I'll pause just a few moments here to allow everyone to vote. Again, small sustained changes in energy intake or expenditure will produce large long-term weight changes. Do you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? I'll give about 5 more seconds for people to add their vote, and then I will close the poll. Okay, the poll has been closed, and I'm going to share the results now. So the majority of people thought that this statement is a fact. However, a close second thought it was a presumption, and less than 10% thought that it was a myth. Okay. And now I'm going to reveal the answer that was put forward by the authors in the publication that I referenced earlier. This statement is in fact a myth. And so this illustrates perfectly the point I was making earlier, that oftentimes we in the public health world aren't quite clear what the scientific evidence shows, and it can be a real challenge to try and keep up with that evidence. But in this case, this concept that small sustained changes in energy intake or expenditure will produce large long-term weight changes, that's been around for a long time. It's based on a half-century-old 3,500 calorie rule, which equates 1 pound of either weight gain or weight loss equal to about 3,500 calories. And the problem is that this analysis comes from a study that was done under conditions that are different from the conditions that the statement are based on. So the study was done in a very low calorie, with a very low calorie diet in young men over a short period of time. And that's where this estimation of 1 pound equaling 3,500 calories came from. However, there's been more research more recently that has revisited this model. So, for example, and in many cases, this new research indicates that this is quite a miscalculation, sometimes by as much as a full magnitude, when you look at changes in energy over time. So, for example, if you consider increasing your energy expenditure by 100 calories per day, by the old rule, the 3,500 calorie rule, that would be 50 pounds over the course of 5 years. The newer models would estimate that changing energy expenditure by 100 calories per day would be more on the order of 10 pounds, and that's assuming no compensation. So this old rule also does not point out that sometimes if people increase their energy expenditure by a certain amount, their bodies will then compensate by consuming more food as well. Okay, we're going to go on to the next statement. Eating more fruits and vegetables will result in weight loss. So let me find the poll. All right, so go ahead and vote. Eating more fruits and vegetables will result in weight loss. All right, I'm going to go ahead and give it 5 more seconds. So if you have a chance, go ahead and enter your vote. We've had over 80% of people have now voted. And I will go ahead and close the poll. And here's the results. So the majority of people thought this was a presumption. About a third thought it was a myth, and a little over 10% selected fact. And this is in fact a presumption, and the reason for that, we commonly hear advice that if you want to lose weight, you should eat more fruits and vegetables, but of course that has to be considered in the context of what else you eat and what other energy expenditure opportunities and patterns are in your life. So just eating more fruits and vegetables if you don't eat less of something else, or if you don't burn more calories, will not help a person with weight loss. And in fact, colleagues of mine and I tested this exact concept a number of years ago, and in this particular study, people were randomly assigned and they were not aware of what the other treatment group was. So they were randomly assigned to a weight loss intervention, either a standard weight loss intervention that followed a calorie counting approach with a 500 calorie deficit per day goal. And these participants tracked everything they ate. They aimed to hit a minimum number of grams of protein per day and some other general healthy diet guidelines with a 500 calorie deficit. And the other group had a target of eating 10 servings of fruits and vegetables per day without a specific calorie target. They were under the understanding that they were trying to lose weight. So these were individuals who were overweight or had obesity, and they were in the program for the purpose of weight loss, but the strategy revolved around checking off a box for the number of fruits and vegetables they consumed each day, with the idea being that perhaps it would be easier to just focus on eating more of the fruits and vegetables rather than reducing foods by counting calories. But as you can see from this graph, the calorie reduction group, the group that counted their calories, actually lost more weight and maintained that weight loss over time better than the vegetable group. And then in a follow-up analysis, I was able to use a biomarker for total fruit and vegetable intake and pool all the study subjects together, because this particular study design, we had no way to control that those in the low calorie counting group would not also increase fruit and vegetable intake. So what we did was we monitored carotenoid levels in their blood, and carotenoids serve as a biomarker of total fruit and vegetable intake. And as you can see from these correlations, as people consumed more total carotenoids, so as you move along these graphs to the right, each of those individuals, the further to the right they go, the more they increased their total carotenoid level or their fruit and vegetable intake. And you can see that people, as they eat more of those fruits and vegetables, they were also more likely to lose more total body weight and more percent body fat. So even though a focus on eating more fruit and vegetables alone based on study diet assignment was not as successful as calorie counting, this study shows that when people did use increased fruit and vegetable intake as a tool with their weight loss efforts, they were more likely to lose weight. So the take-home message there is that adding fruits and vegetables as a strategy for weight loss in the context of watching calories and reducing total caloric intake can be effective. All right, on to the next statement. The built environment influences the prevalence of obesity. So we're going to launch that poll. So this is the built environment. That can mean things like sidewalks, park availability, locations of restaurants. Do you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? The built environment influences the prevalence of obesity. Okay, I'll give about 5 more seconds for everyone to log in their vote. The built environment influences the prevalence of obesity. Is that a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And here's the results. The majority of people, almost 75%, selected fact, around 20% with a presumption, and 5% as a myth. And in this case, we are talking about a presumption. So the built environment in terms of sidewalks and park availability, the basis of this conjecture is that neighborhood environment features may promote or inhibit physical activity, thereby affecting obesity. However, in a systematic review shown here, cited here, there's been multiple studies done, but the majority of them have been observational, and these observational studies have not even shown consistent associations. So a study that's observational is not as conclusive as studies where you can control the randomization and the study design and the exposure to the intervention. Of course, that's a challenge to do in the case of built environments, because there's not too many towns, for example, that would allow us to come in and randomly assign people to live in different neighborhoods with different types of built environments. So it's very difficult to do these kinds of studies without them being observational, but even the observational results have shown inconsistent associations. So at this point, this is still a presumption, and it's a very challenging concept to prove because of the limitations that researchers have. Next statement, genetics play a large role, but heritability is not destiny. So I'm going to open up the polling. Go ahead and vote if you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact. Genetics play a large role, but heritability is not destiny. Okay, is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? All right, I'm going to give it 5 more seconds and then close the poll. So if you haven't voted and you want to, now's your chance. Okay, here we go. The majority selected fact for this statement, with about 1/5 of the people selecting presumption, and then 3% myth. Okay, and this is a fact. It is indeed. So the majority of people had this correct. The implication here is that if we can identify key environmental factors and successfully influence them, then we can achieve clinically significant reductions in obesity. So yes, genetics plays a large role, but it is not the absolute defining factor. Okay, next statement. For overweight kids, programs that involve parents and the home setting promote greater weight loss or maintenance. And here's the poll. For overweight kids, programs that involve parents and the home setting promote greater weight loss or maintenance. Go ahead and add your vote if you haven't yet, and we'll close the poll in about 5 more seconds. Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Okay, so the majority here thought this was a fact, with still about 1/4 thinking it's a presumption, and a smaller percentage selected myth. And this is a fact. Programs that are provided only in schools or other out-of-home structured settings, they may be convenient, and oftentimes they're politically expedient. But we do know from research that programs that include interventions that involve the parents and are provided at home or somehow have an influence on the home environment are likely to yield better outcomes than those that exclusively focus on that out-of-home, other type of structured environment. And of course that makes sense. It's probably even more influential the younger the child is, because the younger the child is, the less control they have over their environment. So if the home environment does not change with regards to physical activity opportunities and exposure to more nutritious versus less nutritious food, then it stands to reason that the interventions would not have as much influence. It doesn't mean that the school-based or other structured out-of-home programs don't have an influence. It's just that by adding that parental home component, you can have a greater influence. Next statement. Setting realistic goals in obesity treatment is important because otherwise patients will become frustrated and lose less weight. So go ahead and vote on this one. Do you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Of course, you're all voting anonymously. This is just a tool to get us considering some of these concepts, and it's oftentimes interesting to see what others think. But just whatever your first instinct is to answer, feel free to answer that. No one's tracking your individual responses. Are setting realistic goals in obesity treatment important because otherwise patients will become frustrated and lose less weight? Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay, the majority of people think this is a fact. About a third think it's a presumption, and a little over 5% think it's a myth. And this is actually a myth. The basis of this conjecture is that according to goal-setting theory, attainable goals impair performance and discourage goal-attaining behavior. So it's not surprising that most of us would think this is a myth, because we learn about behavior change theory, setting SMART goals, and part of the SMART goal is the A for attainable. So this is not surprising that most of us think this is a fact. However, when we look at the obesity treatment literature, it doesn't seem to hold true. And it could be that in obesity treatment, there's lack of congruence between desired and actual weight loss. And that it's thought that that incongruence between desired and actual weight loss could undermine the patient's perceived ability to attain goals, which could lead to the discontinuation of behaviors necessary for weight loss. And there's actually a study, there's several studies, you can look at the paper here for more detail, but one of the studies that has looked at this specifically is this study here, and what they concluded was that in the case of women, less realistic goals were actually associated with greater weight loss at 24 months. In men, that association was not there. So the goals were not associated with either participation rates or with the amount of weight loss. So it also seems in some cases to differ by gender. Okay, next statement. Regularly eating breakfast versus skipping breakfast is protective against obesity. Do you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Eating breakfast rather than skipping breakfast is protective against obesity. Eating breakfast versus skipping breakfast is protective against obesity. All right, I'll give it about 5 more seconds. Go ahead and get your vote in if you want to and haven't had a chance yet. And I'm closing the poll. All right, we had a pretty even split here. For a while it was neck and neck, about a third across, but there is a slight majority at the end here that this is a presumption. And that was also the conclusion of this, of the authors of this paper. There has been some additional research done in this area since the time of this publication in 2013. And here are the conclusions from an author of a review article. This particular author, Dr. Emily Durander, also conducted one of the studies that was done more recently. But in this review article, her conclusions were that the act of eating breakfast compared to skipping it does not appear to have a large impact on body weight. More specific strategies regarding the size and type of breakfast may be required for substantial effect on weight loss. And improving glycemic regulation may be an important reason to consume breakfast rather than skipping it. So keep in mind, it's not that the recommendation is that people should stop eating breakfast if they want to lose weight. Rather, it is acknowledging that it may not be necessary for people to eat breakfast if they want to lose weight. And that when it comes to breakfast, there may be specific strategies such as the protein content. There's been a fair amount of research, for example, done on eggs eaten for breakfast in the morning. There's good understanding that if we distribute our protein more evenly throughout the day, that can have beneficial effects on muscle synthesis, but possibly also on satiety to help us kind of protect against the hunger that can happen throughout the day, because protein does have a strong effect on satiety and a somewhat longer lasting effect on satiety. So keeping this is classified as a presumption, and it's most likely because there are multiple factors to consider. In mind that this is not talking about the evidence regarding breakfast overall. So there are also studies showing that breakfast eaters tend to have a healthier overall nutrient profile of their diet. And then we're also in this case not talking about breakfast in children. So we want to keep in mind when it comes to breakfast and learning and the ability of children to focus in the classroom, that's a different body of evidence. And in those cases, we certainly want to ensure that children have access to breakfast in the morning, because there is a lot of evidence to support that they need that in order to be strong learners in the classroom. Next statement, large rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight outcomes than is slow, gradual weight loss. So here's the poll. Go ahead and vote if you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact. Large rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight outcomes compared to slow, gradual weight loss. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close polling in about 5 more seconds. So if you still want to get your vote in, now's your chance. Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Large rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight outcomes than is slow, gradual weight loss. And I'm closing the poll. So the majority of people here thought that this statement is a fact. But about a third also thought it was a presumption, and a little over 10% think this is a myth. And this is one of those that kind of shifts against what the general population usually thinks is true. The basis for this conjecture is that there was a notable adverse reaction that emerged with regards to weight loss using nutritionally insufficient, very low-calorie diets back in the 1960s. And so this belief has persisted since then. But keeping in mind that was based on nutritionally insufficient very low calorie diets. And very low calorie diets are diets that are based on less than 800 calories per day. However, there's been more research more recently, and here is a review article, for example, that reviewed studies looking at this, and they concluded that within weight loss trials, more rapid and greater initial weight loss has been associated with lower body weight at the end of the long-term follow-up. But they did note that additional therapy during that follow-up period does need to be added in order to support weight maintenance of the initial program. Okay, next statement. Breastfeeding is protective against obesity. And this particular statement is referring to obesity of that child into, throughout childhood and into adulthood. It's not referring to the obesity risk for the mother. So breastfeeding is protective against obesity. And do you think that is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? All right, a few more seconds left to get your vote in if you have not already. Breastfeeding is protective against obesity. Myth, presumption, or fact? I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. The majority of people, but less than half, thought that this is a fact, about 40% a presumption, and around 15% a myth. And this is a myth. The basis of this conjecture, this belief that breastfed children are less likely to become obese, has persisted far more than a century, and it's very passionately defended. There's a World Health Organization, a WHO report, that states that people who were breastfed as infants are less likely to be obese later in life, and that the association is not likely to be due to publication bias or confounding. However, the WHO themselves did find clear evidence of publication bias in the published literature that it synthesized. So the same organization that made that initial statement also found clear publication bias when they did further analyses. There's also been studies with better control for confounding variables, and a randomized control trial that involved more than 13,000 children who were followed for more than 6 years. And those studies provided no compelling evidence of an effect of breastfeeding on obesity. So it certainly also does not mean that the reverse is true, but that there was not a protective effect of obesity. It's important to keep in mind that although breastfeeding does not have anti-obesity effects in children, there are other positive health effects, and that means that we should encourage breastfeeding. So the fact that this statement is a myth does not equal that we should discourage breastfeeding. It just means that encouraging breastfeeding for the purpose of obesity risk is not appropriate. And it's also important to keep in mind that if you promote an activity based on false reasons, could there be unintended consequences? So if a woman is believing that she's going to really cause damage or challenge the health of her child because of not breastfeeding, but there are a lot of barriers in place for her around that breastfeeding, there could be a significant amount of stress and anxiety caused to that mother that might not be warranted based on the evidence. So rather consider a more impactful use of our resources would be to ensure that women in all circumstances have choices and support to facilitate breastfeeding so that they can choose to breastfeed, make it as easy as possible. But unfortunately, oftentimes women in our society face lots of challenges with regards to maternity leave, other family member leave after a child is born, and then the environment where they work and how easily it facilitates activities like pumping, and then childcare opportunities. So if it's challenging to find childcare near where the mother works, or those sorts of considerations, it can make breastfeeding very challenging to establish and maintain. Okay, next statement. PE classes play an important role in reducing or preventing obesity. Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? PE classes play an important role in reducing or preventing obesity. All right, I'll give it about 5 more seconds for any remaining votes to come in. PE classes play an important role in reducing or preventing obesity. And I'm going to close the poll. So the majority thought this was a presumption, a little over 50%, 30% fact, and almost 20% myth. And this is a myth. So physical education classes in their current form don't actually, there's no evidence to support that they impact body weight or body mass index. The health benefits of physical activity of sufficient duration, frequency, and intensity, it's assumed that that will impact adiposity, but there's actually not evidence to support that. But that's the basis of the conjecture for this statement. It's important to keep in mind that the purpose of physical education, PE classes, is not targeted at weight. PE classes are designed to teach children how to enjoy different types of physical activity, to learn about their bodies and how to be physically active, why it's important for their health, and hopefully to how to participate in physical activities that they can enjoy for a lifetime. It is good to note that in a Cochrane review, the citation is here, when they reviewed studies overall that were school-based physical activity interventions, so in some cases that included PE classes, but it could also include things like classroom physical activity breaks, that these school-based physical activity interventions in general were successful at increasing the duration of physical activity, decreasing the time spent watching TV, increasing physical fitness levels, and increasing the amount of time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So despite this statement being a myth, don't dismiss the importance of physical activity in schools, because there is a lot of evidence indicating that school-based physical activity interventions can have positive effects. They may just not be related to obesity, body composition, or body mass index. Okay, next statement. Early childhood is the period during which we learn exercise and eating habits that influence our weight throughout life. Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? This is our second to last poll. Go ahead and fill in your answer. Early childhood is the period during which we learn exercise and eating habits that influence our weight throughout life. Okay, I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds and then I will close the poll. All right, and here's the results. The majority think this is a fact, although a close second think this is a presumption, with just about 6% voting for myth. And this is a presumption. The basis of this conjecture is that weight for height indices, eating behaviors and preferences that are present in early childhood are correlated with those later in life. That's oftentimes what people assume. And although a person's body mass index, or BMI, typically tracks over time, in other words, it tends to be in a similar percentile range as the person ages. Although that's true, the longitudinal genetic studies suggest that such tracking may be primarily a function of genotype rather than a persistent effect of early learning. So the problem we have here, a big reason why this is classified as a presumption, is that there really are no randomized controlled clinical trials that provide evidence to the contrary that this is more influenced by genetics than by early childhood behaviors that get learned. Okay, final statement. Regardless of body weight or weight loss, increasing exercise increases health. Do you think this is a myth, a presumption, or a fact? Regardless of body weight or weight loss, increasing exercise increases health. All right, I'll give it about 5 more seconds and close the poll. Regardless of body weight or weight loss, increasing exercise increases health. Is this a myth, a presumption, or a fact? And I'm closing the poll. And here's the results. The large majority voted fact, with about 15% presumption and 5% myth. And this is a fact. Exercise offers a way to mitigate the health damaging effects of obesity, even without weight loss. So it's definitely true that we want to encourage everyone to be as physically active as they are able, regardless of whether or not that leads to weight loss, because there are many health benefits to that physical activity. Of important note also is that decreasing sedentary time, even if that is done in a way that does not increase physical activity, has its own health benefits. And that can often be very important when working with people who have obesity, because oftentimes the higher intensity physical activity is challenging for those individuals, but the general movement and decreasing that sedentary time has its own unique health benefits. That's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So that's the summary, or that's the conclusion of that part of the presentation. We will open it up to discussion questions now, discussion and/or questions now. So feel free to add that in the chat box on your screen. And this slide shows the website for our institute and my email address. So if you have any additional questions that you don't get a chance to ask today, or you want to just follow up with me one-on-one, feel free to reach out to me by email.
Thank you so much, Leah. I just wanted to remind everyone that this session, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived on the msdcenter.org website.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read off one of the questions. I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible, but again, I'll leave my email address here on the screen. So if I do not get to your question, please feel free to email me so that I can follow up with you after the webinar. The first question: healthcare providers are commonly focused on weight loss, reduced BMI, to achieve improved health. Based on your experience, is this a disservice to fat individuals? What can be changed? Specifically, what other markers provide a more accurate evaluation of our health? So it is true that there are other indicators that can be as important or even more important than BMI on a person's health risk. And so it's important for healthcare providers to use BMI as an initial tool. But also when we look at someone's BMI, we are looking at their weight for height. We are not looking at how much adiposity they have. So ideally, healthcare providers would use body composition, which would allow them to track changes in body fat over time. So one aspect that applies to this particular question is that as a person changes their lifestyle to add more physical activity and potentially decrease caloric intake, their weight could actually stay the same or go up while their body composition becomes healthier. Because by building muscle while losing fat, you could maintain or increase total body weight. So certainly BMI is not the best or ideal tool for tracking change over time. But in addition to that, as this person who asked the question points out, there are other indicators that are important to keep in mind as well. So a person could change lifestyle and start to improve their overall lipid profiles and other metabolic risk factors while possibly not changing their weight at all. It's also worth noting that sometimes as little as 5 to 10% change in body weight, decrease in body weight, can have fairly significant changes in health risk, reducing health risk. So most healthcare providers should be adequately trained to help individuals know which markers to track. But as I mentioned, things like lipid profiles, blood pressure level, and all of these things are going to vary by individual. So there will be some people that regardless of their weight, they will never have high blood pressure, and there will be other people who are genetically predisposed to high blood pressure. So the correct markers to track really vary based on the individual. An important thing to keep in mind that isn't specifically addressed with this question, but it gets at it to some extent, healthcare providers are commonly focused on weight loss, and we do know that weight loss in general will help improve health risks. However, diet and exercise are not the only tools in the weight loss toolbox, and it's important for healthcare providers to be adequately trained to access all of those tools when working with their patients, and to keep in mind, as I showed in an earlier slide, that obesity is a very complex disease and it is a disease. So we would not tell a person with high blood pressure that, you know, unless you change your diet and exercise more, I really can't help you. We would most likely put them on blood pressure medication. Well, the same kind of example goes for obesity. There are weight loss medications. In all cases, a healthier diet and a more active lifestyle are recommended. We want that for all individuals, regardless of their weight status. So that should be the basis of every treatment plan, that healthy eating and active living are integrated into what an individual is striving for. But in some individual cases, medications and surgery also need to be used, or it becomes very challenging for that individual to maintain physical activity and healthy diet. Okay, let me go to another question here. One of the questions was, will the recording be available later? And as Veronica indicated, yes, it will. Do we have any other questions? Those are the only questions I'm seeing right now. Unless, Veronica, you see any others, please let me know.
No, I don't see any other questions.
Okay, I'm going to hang on just a few more minutes to see if anyone has any follow-up questions. I will also advance the slides one more. If you'd like one more chance to see how those statements were categorized, they're also color-coded. So this last slide here goes through all the statements that we covered today, And if they're red in color, they're a myth. If they're purple, they are a presumption. And if they're green, they are a fact. So that gives everyone one more chance if they were curious or missed some of the early statements. All right, I still do not see any other questions. I will put my email address back up if anyone has any questions they'd rather address with me individually. Veronica, is there anything else we need to do?
No, that's it. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Leah, for the presentation, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all.